Hi, this is Privateer Station, and today we bring you day 605 of Russian war with Ukraine. As always, with former advisor to the Office of the President of Ukraine, Lieutenant Colonel Alexei Arestovich, and in this new format with Nikolai Feldman, Ukrainian journalist, blogger, and Yuri Romanenko. The focus of today's stream mostly lies in the sphere of geopolitics related to groundbreaking Biden speech on October 20th. Special thanks go to Bill for continuous super thanks, much appreciated. Please do not forget, guys, to click like and subscribe. This definitely helps our channel to grow. And with this, let's deep dive into day 605. Enjoy. Hello, everybody. This is Project Alpha. My name is Nikolai Feldman. You're watching live War Diaries with Alexei Arestovich and Yuri Romanenko. Good evening, gentlemen. Yes, good evening. Hi, everybody. Let's start with rather groundbreaking, as the media report, speech by President Biden of the United States, which defines a certain planning horizon for a lot of events, including our military events here. Yuri Romanenko touched on a bunch of opinions in his streams. Let's start with you. How do you see this speech? Why do you think it changes or defines a lot? Yes, sure. Yesterday with Peter Pulpa, we did a detailed dive in, so you can watch that stream. But for the viewers of our stream today, I'll just do the highlights, why it was important. First of all, Biden highlighted Ukraine as the most important, one of the most important allies of the United States, together with Israel. And he underlined that right now it is the fight for democracy that will define for the next dozen years what the world will be like. He is saying that during the next 4 or 5 years, new configuration of the world system will be defined, which will serve as security net, same as a certain coalition, a certain architecture helped the world to exist for 60 years after the Second World War. So in this brief speech by Biden, we get a whole new situation for Ukraine we could only dream of. Because in fact, United States will be demanding Ukraine to adhere to that rather tall mission that is to be carried on the shoulders of Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, Korea. These missions require different functionality and different capability to carry it. And Ukraine just has no chances to not change. Because the importance of that mission that was mentioned, in case of failure, where it was, for example, like in Afghanistan, where elites did not want to change anything, and at the end we had the crush and crumble of the regime and government there. So if Ukraine follows suit of Afghanistan, then United States will have a huge breach on the European theater, and it will pose a serious threat to the world order that United States is looking to aid in implementing with their partners. And Ukraine, therefore, cannot dream to be on its own, to be able to zig and zag somewhere in the fields by itself. Today, it finds itself as a pivotal piece of an architecture that holds the destiny of the world. And that's what I wanted to start with. Alexei, your mic. Sure, we only could dream about that attitude, because now we're getting following suit of Japan and Germany after the Second World War, especially South Korea. I want to remind what it was: 130th place in economy, military junta after the Korean War, a series of military coups, unfinished war, martial law, a lot of Maidans, civilian protests, with deaths of up to 1,500 people last time in the 80s. A lot of local oligarchs, unruly, and that was all happening with American presence. ex-presidents being arrested and brought to court. So the country was in turmoil. And then they made a decision that they cannot continue going on like this. And today, Korea is number 7 in the world. They also have their space program, and we are expecting their help in our war here. This is very good because people in Ukraine need to understand a very important thing, continuing Yura's thought, that they will not be able to just sit it out. And even stealing money of our partners and our own resources within will not be treated as considered a main crime in the eyes of the global community and our allies. The main crime will be disturbance of their geostrategic plans. So they started a strategic game which was basically equalized by Biden to the scale of the Second World War and to the consequences. And the bets are exactly the same as United States had in the previous 2 world wars and the Cold War. It means that anybody who will be resisting to these plans or who will be weakening these plans will be judged differently. One thing is if you are just a thief. Another, if you are precluding geostrategic plans of United States from happening. So, as you know, in the crime world, there could be commercial and financial crimes. Then there are bureaucratic crimes, a bit harder. And then there are ones above it that actually break geostrategic plans or international plans of the country. I would not want any of our oligarchs to be there in these ways. I look at it positively. I would wish them to be able to change faster because I generally understand the degree of responsibility and how they will be judged. Because this is no joke anymore. This is not a financial crime as it was before. It's not even a crime against the United States, for which Lazarenko was in jail, by the way, for years and years. And if you are a code-breaking geostrategic game, the punishment is very harsh. Biden would not say that in his speech, but I would say here that everything will be very, very stern. Yes, Nikolai, I want to clarify a couple things here about your thesis about money and corruption. That doesn't mean that there'll be less attention to that. Of course, there'll be more attention and they'll be checking where was it spent to. It doesn't mean that they'll close the eyes for corruption. There are different kinds of money, right? There are money that are destined for development of that strategic project. That will be brought to court as breaking into the geostrategic world and the plans, geostrategic plans, not just thievery. So I want to step in that our corruptoids, our corrupt oligarchs need to understand that it's a destiny of civilization that is being solved here. And this is the angle that United States will be looking at things happening here. So all these little dealings and things that you guys, some of them may be thinking that there is an American budget, there is an aid budget, international aid, and then there is local budget where you can steal some money from. And if you steal locally, don't steal American, then it'll be okay. No, now it will be considered as a joint resource. United States are really going full speed to forming a joint coalition of the West, democratic coalition, if you want, or democratic axis against the authoritarian axis. Therefore, they'll be looking at the resources that are available. So without this coalition, it's impossible to win against a similar coalition, a similar group of countries that are playing against you. What you see in Israel, what you see in Ukraine, for example, when that coalition in faces of Iran and Korea are supplying arms to Russia to fight Ukraine. So the world generally goes to the state of war. Analysts in the West are already not shy of comparing the events here with the World War. And the United States is generally preparing for a conflict on 2 sides, China on one side and Russia on the other. And all that petty thievery that we had in Ukraine that was considered to be a local issue before now becomes an obstacle to the win of the global coalition, period. So look, in the Soviet Union, you could commit several kinds of crimes. You could steal a chicken from your factory or your agriculture farm. This is local police. Guards would probably intercept you, and then there'd be a local court. That would be one level. The other, there would be a KGB knocking on your door for federal crimes. And now we're talking about the level of crimes which is above that KGB level. And I seriously do not advise, just on the human level, to any of those who are making money this way to be in that way anymore. So, what was also important in Biden's speech, and when it was made, the speech was made during Putin's visit to President Xi of China. He made that speech on purpose when those two shook their hands and met in China. And he sent a very direct message, and he's elaborating the thought that was voiced in March of 21 when Russian troops were just getting deployed, then Biden's meeting with Putin in Switzerland, and even then it already started to form. Freedom against dictatorship. In its core, it basically announced the beginning of a new Cold War, which turned into a hot war in less than a year. And all that was going in a triangle, Beijing, Moscow, and the United States. Biden highlighted that, and today we see that this is an element of American politics, of a certain consensus in American world, and how he is formulating his speech. Guys, you may think that this is my election campaign, but let's drop the election aspect of it. Let's remember who are we and what America exists for. Many people say that right now we're wasting money on Ukraine, wasting money on Israel in vain. This is not expense. These are investments into our civilizational victory on the global scale. He is saying that when he refers to 4 or 5 years, he's meaning elections in Russia and elections in the United States, regardless of who is being elected. We know who will be elected in Russia, but regardless who comes to that in America, when we'll have probably elections here in Ukraine in some capacity. So he's basically sending a message to himself or to some leaders who will follow him, who will be designing the destinies of the world. And this is otherwise the term of the Second World War that were happening for about 4 or 5 years, 6 years. It likely will lead to the same skirmishes among different countries around the world, and that will lead to the global structure similar to what was devised in Potsdam Conference. And the world will probably be defined to 2070, 2090 from here. And I think he may be a little wrong here because the history doesn't exactly repeat itself. It will not be an exact analogy to the previous system, even though that was a follow of similar systems before. It's difficult to predict how that system will look like, but definitely there will be some system that will be designing the relations between countries. And the message that he is sending, we are Americans. We need to remember that we are for freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. Nobody can be prosecuted for their opinion. Everybody can speak about anything. You can praise Hitler and Putin, as he says, but and we will not bring you to court for that. We may disagree with you, and we may argue with you, but that's about it. And he is bringing a common sense principle that a foreign policy is always the extension of the home policy. And the principles for which we became America, for which we live here, and with all the differences internally, we bring these things outward. We are fighting for the principles that we live for. And this is a very important thing. When you fight for principles that you live for, that fight never doesn't have expiration date. You take away the statements, oh, we are tired from this conflict. You cannot be tired from living and following your own principles. Remember, I spoke about 2 or 3 weeks ago that we need to be selling a different way here. Our actions in this war, we need to be putting most of our emphasis that we are a democracy fighting against dictatorship. And the West will continue supporting us in this case. They will not if we are choosing a different model. And here's the West coming out and devising this collective aspect. Biden doesn't call exact countries on the axis of evil. Beijing, Damascus, Moscow, Pyongyang, and Tehran, and he includes Ukraine into the Western group of allies. De facto and de jure, they're calling us a part of the Western group. You're one of the chain links resisting the axis of evil. And this is a fundamental turn, a pivotal moment that will have a lot of consequences. And now nobody will be able to say, despite the shape of the front, despite of the success of counteroffensive and successes of our troops on the front, information front, which some people deny, economic front that not many people understand, diplomatic front, we all have chosen a very important thing. it may be more important than a formal joining NATO, although that is also important. It's acknowledging that we are part of the West and we're part of the axis resisting the axis of evil. Not a single drop of blood by the Ukrainian soldier is not spilled in vain, especially after this statement. Before that, there were discussions, but we basically, after this divide, we have chosen us to be on that side of the Iron Curtain. The world in the future may take different shapes, but on this stage, our forces, our people have won the intermediary victory in that geopolitical struggle. We have found ourselves on the right side, on the true side. The West, of course, has a lot of drawbacks, but there is a fundamental difference. Expansion of freedoms versus the suppression of freedoms and rights. And the West is on the expansion side of it. And Ukraine would be good to self-reflect. When Americans are saying that we are fighting for the freedom of speech, and that is their value, we need to ask ourselves, do we have freedom of speech, or are some topics being considered off topic and not to be discussed? When Biden says that they're fighting for respecting of all the basic rights of humans despite of religious and other affiliations, we need to bring this up again here. Because one thing, our theoretical discussions with the Tsuk here on that stream, the other is what is happening on the country scale. And that defines our position in the coalition. And the answers to this question define our position in the coalition of democratic countries. In essence, it is the Third World War that's being announced. And we are given the criteria that makes us belong to that camp. And if we actually go and analyze how well are we doing as a society, on some criteria, we are very leaning to the other side against which we're fighting. And we need to address that. We need to make sure we don't topple. So this is a very uncomfortable surprise for those parties and forces here in Ukraine who want to make another new Hungary here with somebody like Orban and create a monocultural project here, because this project is not being attacked now by Romanenko and Arestovich only. This kind of project is being told us by President Biden that these criteria that these projects have, they will not carry you to the democratic camp. And any public speaker in Ukraine now who will try to resist to these democratic values, we can address him directly and say, hey, is that where you want us to take us out of the democratic camp and leave us alone in face of evil? And we'll get an answer, oh, probably not, no, that's not my intent. So this adds a different lever for us to push. By the way, Alexei, what else is important? It is not only pertaining to Ukraine and allies of the United States, it also touches upon the United States itself, because Dmitry Rodionov on my channel is asking a question. I have a feeling that Trump may become a president. He might disturb the whole story of great plans of the United States and allies. So what Biden is doing now is reformatting the agenda, the inner agenda for the United States as well, because he's trying to get United States from that inner party qualms and quarrels into the global level of existential fight with their real enemies and the enemies of their values, and that everything that will not be helping United States to win the struggle will be an obstacle, will be treated as obstacle, and treated as something that needs to be reviewed. Because, for example, what's going on with Israel, it definitely affects the politics of Republican Party. Trump was building his external politics based on that. And now joining Ukraine, matters of Ukraine and Israel, Biden combined all that in one elegant structure where Republicans will be at a difficult position to not support dedicating financial support to Israel and Ukraine. So it started a very important process internally in the United States that will also define and change the logic of election campaign, that will have a bunch of risks, of course, and there was a threat that we may lose some support if certain parties come to power. So look what he basically is saying, turning to his American citizens. America ran rather far in its social and political experiments, and we could have run even further, but here we have a global conflict, a global war, if you want. And the challenge is such that we need to respond to that. It's not inner qualms where we'll go, because what was the pivotal point there internally is that the United States is at a certain developmental ceiling, and they now need to determine where they're going. And he's saying, stop. The question of where United States is going to go now is a part of a global agenda, because who wins globally will define where can United States go together with the world. And that conflict actually will define where the whole world will go, authoritarian or freedom. And he is underlining the moment that the fight is going about the same fundamental principles that formed the United States, because why people left Europe? They were running for the United States, trying to build that city on shining city on the hill. They were persecuted by the religious principles there and other ways, and they were running for the United States, trying to obtain their freedoms. And he's saying that everything is reactualized again. We are these United States again. We are the troops of Washington who are going against the British rifles of the empire at the day. We are those Americans who were going to Europe and going against German machine guns during D-Day, the ones who were fighting against the enemies in the Korean War. We are like those forefathers and ancestors who are fighting for freedom. It is the same price for us. It is the same question for the United States. But since we are one of the greatest or the greatest nation in the world and the richest nation in the world, it is a global responsibility on our shoulders. And he appeals to American citizens that they need to defend global American ideals against global threats. And this is the end of discussion that America is no longer a global police, that it needs to just focus on internal policies and politics. The world is multipolar, and America will not be interfering into processes. He is saying basically, no, the role of the United States is the same, and it will be defined in that fight, which, by the way, can include some nuclear aspects to that, and we'll talk about it. And I have a sacramental question here. Who is making America great again? Yeah, right, Biden apparently this time. And I have another question here, Alexei, about the position related to freedom of expression. Biden, in my opinion, put into juxtaposition freedom to express oneself and hateful propaganda of aggressive war, which is a crime, which is a internationally recognized crime. Thing is, it doesn't have exact criteria. It's somewhat murky. And I think the future will put certain framework on that. In your opinion, Alexei, where does the framework lie now? I think, Nikolai, it will still have to be defined. One thing is to talk that the war may happen. The other is to call for that war to be started. Our side, we basically stating the obvious that the war could have been and the war might happen and the war is happening. So we're not calling for war, we're just calculating the probabilities. And what did the ambassador of North Korea recently say? He said that transfer of atoms to Ukraine from the United States puts Europe into the perpetual war. However, who is leading the rhetoric of continuous war and the necessity to respond? It's Putin's narrative. We have not started anything. We've been just responding, right? They've responded to threats in our Bucha, and they're responding to threats by bombing Ukrainian cities, and they're responding by throwing their troops in Syria, right? They're so poor and they're only defending themselves. All these things will still yet to be defined. And I want to outline once again for our Ukrainian colleagues that criteria is being drawn already. And many of you, in your emotional fervor, already are falling out of the framework of that criteria. So you might rethink your position. Right, Alexei. And Maria Tanavetskaya has well defined that position which Ukraine jumped into. It's the queen in checkers. Ukraine has now a real chance of becoming that queen in the global game of checkers. I hope we don't waste this unique chance. Guys, please do not forget to click the like button for that stream. It helps us. Every like is 10 more eyeballs on us. And developing the topic with Biden, I want to look into Europe as well, because it is obvious that this existential challenge that the West is facing, Europe is facing too, as part of the West, and probably even more than America. And they have more problems, I guess, and they're more disconnected. So today in Berliner Zeitung, there was an interesting interview with Gerhard Schröder. On my channel, I put the translation, and I would advise our readers, viewers, to read through. This is an example of how a rather big part of European elites still think that generally they can still find ways to negotiate with Putin somehow, that they may resolve this war diplomatically. And I'm reading from it. What do Russians want? A status quo in Donbass and Crimea. Nothing else. I think it was a fatal mistake for Putin to start the operation, the special operation and the war. But at the same time, if you look at Turkey, they already have, as a member of NATO, missiles that can reach Moscow. And side comment here that Finland is also a NATO country, and now missiles can reach Moscow much faster. And United States wanted to bring NATO to the borders of Russia, and Russia took Ukraine as the buffer, and they have some rationale behind that. Russians reacted to that motion by mixing both factors, and they tried to supersede the NATO motion and attacked Ukraine first. So he is saying basically that Russians will not start a war with any NATO member, so Poland is not in danger. And I think that we need to highlight that on all the European platforms, that this position is deadly dangerous for Europe itself and for Germany itself too. Because what is happening in Israel and what is gathering more and more steam as we see all these pro-Palestinian marches in Europe, how they try to rattle that situation internally without exact identification of a threat, the West is risking to be thrown into the inner squabble, which will end very sadly. Just like in 1914, 1915, which basically was a fight internally in the West, who is going to lead where. Listen, I definitely recommend, Yuri, to everybody as well, to read Schroeder's interview. In Ukraine, it's often presented as a compromised material or compromised figure commenting on that situation. One needs to learn from the way he builds logic and builds his argument in this article. He makes a lot of conclusions and logic in the way he puts things there. So you can see a very brilliant education, a brilliant politician talking behind that. Grand narratives are very precise and very logical. But that grand narrative is defending Russia and giving Russia the qualities of defensive strategy. He marks Putin's politics as defensive strategy. And let's remember the history. When Putin brought back Soviet hymn anthem in 2001, was it defensive strategy? When in 2007 he quits the agreement of conventional arms in Europe, is it defensive strategy? When Putin makes his famous Munich speech that we're fighting with all of you, is it defensive strategy? When Putin attacks Georgia, is it defensive strategy? When Putin starts Tuzla conflict, is it defensive strategy? When Putin and his GRU officers are trying to blow up Chernogorия parliament, Montenegro parliament, is that defensive strategy? When they're sending refugees across the border, on the border with the European countries, is that defensive strategy? When disorders in Kosovo are being provoked, is it defensive strategy? Israel right now numbering the threats, besides Hezbollah and Iran, they're also naming the Israeli Arabs who were also rebelling and who tried to attack police stations in East Jerusalem. This is the core territory of Israel. That's not even argued. And this is the second part of the equation that Schroeder either doesn't understand or he purposely omits, which states that attack on the NATO country by Russia doesn't mean that Russian jets took off and attacked NATO country, literally. Although they did shoot down American drone, American UAV over the Black Sea. What I mean is that there is a bunch of weak points in the West that can be inspired from within. And one can provoke a hybrid war in Europe with uprisings of the Arabs, the criminals, the lefts, or sure then Germany doesn't remember what the Red Brigades were and how they shattered and influenced public opinion back in the 70s that defined the direction of German politics. That was a terrorist group that was blowing up supermarkets and markets and people. And there was just one group. What if there'll be 50 of them? And what about the explosion of the Nord Streams and recent destruction of the communication cables between Finland and Estonia, where there was supposedly some Chinese freighter who dropped something, which actually is a sign of aggression. And bringing that to just direct armed conflicts is too narrow minded. Although one can say that Russian jets keep breaking the airspace of the Baltic countries, they maneuver dangerously close to the limits in Syria. They are threatening civilian shipment in the Black Sea. They provoke the grain crisis, food crisis in a global scale. They increase the price of grain noticeably, and it shook countries from Tunisia to Algeria and many others. Is that all a defensive strategy? I have to disagree with Schroeder on that, and I think many reasonable people will disagree. This has all signs of attack on the West and the global interests, from shaking the international food commodities prices and to disrupting the gas and hydrocarbons pipelines, which, by the way, Germany suffered from that directly. So, besides that speech being very logical, very proper in terms of rhetoric, it has a false grand narrative. That is the weakest part of that speech, a false grand narrative. And as Yuri said, we need to dispel the errors in grand messaging. We need to speak not only about Moscow's strategy here. Russia, China, Iran, they're not leading defensive strategy. Iran, that provoked 3 wars regionally, is definitely not doing a defensive strategy. This way, one can continue in the same framework. If you're saying that Russia is defending, one can say that Gaza is defending itself, right? Oh, yeah, they're already saying that, Alexei. Right, and then we go into Orwell. War is peace, peace is war, truth is lies, lies is truth. And trust me, there are a lot of weak points in Europe, starting with refugees. Recently, there were some more refugees disembarking on the shores of Spain. I was looking at the videos. It seems like some of them definitely went through some marine training because they were so skilled getting off the boats. And there was not a single woman or an elderly person, very sporty, very agile refugees. Somebody actually needed to train in order to disembark this well. So there were specific ones coming through. And in Europe, I think there is about 33 potential conflict points, Basques and the like. And there are reasons and there are ways to quarrel the countries between themselves, Turkey and Greece, you know. You don't even need just the hybrid stuff. You can also shatter by pressing these conflict points. And the spectrum of threats is very large. So looking at all that and looking at the actions of the axis of evil, it's no damn defense strategy. It's very attacking strategy. And Alexei, I want to also talk about another aspect of Schroeder's speech about Istanbul agreements, Turkish agreements, that there were 5 points: 2 languages in Ukraine, refusal from joining NATO, guarantees of safety for Donbass regions. You wrote in one of the posts recently that you, as a participant of those agreements, you've been there, you've seen the process. I think the points were a little bit different that he outlines in this interview. Then Putin was also manipulating these Turkish negotiations, that everything supposedly was signed, and then Ukrainian side was the one to quit, to withdraw from these agreements. I remember situation being different. I remember Putin deciding to throw more troops into Donbass and deciding to make a bigger story there when he failed under Kiev. Correct, Nikolai. Schroeder either doesn't know or he knowingly manipulates the facts. So first, what Ukraine was going to sign in Istanbul was just the beginning of position of Russian Federation in negotiations. After the conflict and after the failure of Russia in Kiev operation, they already withdrew their points about not joining NATO and two languages. There was only one notable article that we disagreed upon was the dwindling of Ukrainian army. Russia asked for something laughable like 50,000. Zelensky's position was at least 250,000, the minimum that we had when the war started. And they decided to probably agree on that one-on-one with Putin at some point. And I think Medinsky and the other side also has records of that. And probably somebody will eventually dig it up and show it to historians. So he was the head of delegation from the Russian side, and Arahamian was the head of our delegation. And they were basically saying that, okay, we don't care about NATO, we don't care about you joining that, about languages, but we do care about the size of your army. And with every unsuccessful storm of Kiev, they were removing one additional point. And at the end, we only had just the limitation of military in this agreement. And I will tell you one more scary thing, that they actually agreed for Crimea to have an international status. They also left it to one-on-one on the presidential level, but they were considering 10 or 15 years of negotiations on the Crimea status, with some degree of demilitarization on the side of Russia, and the degree of demilitarization was also to be discussed. Removal of Black Sea Fleet, removal of Air Force bases. So they basically almost gave up everything. And that's why when Schroeder is bringing this thought that Ukraine agreed to these 5 points, this is absolutely not correct. You can actually read that in the Istanbul communique that was officially published. It's in the open media. And the second aspect, that he accuses United States in everything. And there's a phrase there where the journalist asked him that Bucha interrupted these negotiations. He says, no, on the 19th of March, there was no Bucha yet. I want to remind that the negotiation was happening on the 28th, 29th of March. On the 19th, Russian leader of delegation Medinsky was giving us compliments of how bravely Ukraine defends itself, and he was saying that, yeah, we probably should withdraw the two-language requirement from that. At the beginning, they actually did ask for changing the history books, etc., etc. I want to remind that the vice head of the operative leadership of the military command, who the first time commented on this war, before meeting in Istanbul, he came out and changed the goals, the declared goals of that operation. And if you read it thoroughly, they removed denazification, which they had there before. So I remember how stage after stage they were withdrawing articles from their demand list. And I remember seeing all that unfolding. I was participating in these negotiations with the Russian side. So I know what was there. And here, Schroeder either is misinformed by his, for example, Russian partners, or he consciously skews the data. But let's give him some benefit of the doubt and think that he is ill-informed. All right. We also promised to talk about the big story of a big commission and report of the commission, Congress Commission on the Strategic Position of the United States, and it's a bipartisan commission which came to a conclusion that right now everything is worse than in the darkest days of the Cold War. United States missed that. United States are now rethinking their nuclear capabilities, and in light of being ready to resist the conflict and control the conflict in Europe and in Asia possibly. So Yura, I know you're also diving into this topic. Could you give us some highlights? What's the most important? The most important here is that they're coming back to an idea that there could be two simultaneous wars in the doctrine with use of nuclear weapons on two theaters. Before, they excluded that from their strategy, and they only were considering possible one war. And now they're also defining a time frame that after 2027, these situations may happen. And one needs to say, and I was reading some Chinese data, that in China they're also looking at 2027 as the year when the war might start between China and the United States. So this is a very important moment, because practically what Biden was saying in his speech about military-industrial complex, which will likely be used in their inner political fight, he sent a message to electors that don't look at the weapons that we give to Ukraine and Israel, that they are waste for American economy. No, this create jobs in Arizona. We're building F-15s, we're building new missiles and new defense systems. And he's nodding to the experience of the Second World War, when United States had 52% of GDP globally, because United States was the production hub, and that's how they became a global hegemon of industrialization, industrialized production. So American military-industrial complex is revving up again, and I was looking at some statistics on the production in the world. So in Russia and in the United States, during the last month, 1.9% in September versus August, there is a growth. The quality of this growth is different, given that US GDP is probably 10 times bigger than Russian. And 1.9% growth in the United States is quantitatively a huge difference between what Russia grew in terms of industrial production. So if you see these stats, you can see when the arms race has restarted again. Of course, it's not just arms, but you can see that there are a lot of money being pumped into the military complex now. Also, Poland, our immediate neighbor, who is adopting increased budgets and resetting its army, and is building an army for 350,000 people. Germany started their way too. They increased their industrial production by 0.6%. So arms race is on. And Ukraine needs to participate in this as well, because it's a God-given order. There were other two interesting statements this week. And in the press, there was a news that China grew the number of their nuclear warheads to 1,000, which is still rather far from Russia, that has 6,500, and America, which has 6,500 as well. There was a statement by the head of Minister of Defense of Australia, right? Yeah. So he, on the International Defense Forum in Pacific region, he stated that Australian Army cannot stand aside. And he was talking about their logistics capabilities to move the army to the north if need be. And I ask everybody to pay attention to a stream with Alina Gritsenko and Likusa on our stream, where she showed the oil transit ways, which go to China. 80% of that oil go through Strait of Malacca. That's right there, near Korea, near Malaysia. This is where 5th US Fleet is based. This is where all the naval forces of Australia is looking at. Remember, there was a scandal when Brits supposedly took a contract for building submarines away from France. Australian Army is actually a good indicator for seriousness of intentions. They're growing their military probably in the biggest pace since the Second World War. And these submarines are intended for intercept of these transport routes. And 80% of Chinese exports also go through the Strait of Malacca. We understand how painful it is for China if that pathway is going to be cut. And China also built 5 serious naval groups. America is putting enough effort there. Nobody's hiding there that there will be likely a war. Unlike here in Ukraine, where we were told till the end that there's not going to be a war, over there, they're actually telling their citizens on a governmental level, saying that strategically there could be a conflict all the way up to a nuclear conflict, and we need to be ready. So their degree of political maturity is different. And here is the question of intercept of India as a strategic partner with its fleet, who can also block certain trade routes, because a lot of things go through Indian Ocean as well. and India has a control over that space. And that strategy of turning India into a new China, basically, and transfer of India goods through Saudi Arabia and Israel and Greece to replace the Silk Road that China was propping up. And Chinese, when they were receiving Putin, they actually aligned their tables in the shape of a Silk Road. So the tragedy that was happening in Israel and continuous throwing of matches into that fire, it shows once again that, first of all, attack from Gaza is not a random event. Israel is a definite sensitive area that is questionable for China. And I'm leading to state that it is not an accident. And even though China has it mentioned in 2027 for the Syrian conflict, that party already started. That event, that effort already started. They're already attacking the effective partnership between the West and India. And it's a definite signal for me that Israeli tankers are being shot at with Russian Cornets and North Koreans' anti-tank missiles. That definitely was a sign for me that that's Chinese trace in this event. And it's important to note here, in regards to the statement by Richard Marles, Minister of Defense of Australia, he actually connected all that with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. During his visit to South Korea, he highlighted that Russia's invasion into Ukraine was the fiasco of the Truman containment policy, that we failed to preclude Russia or stop Russia from starting a big war in Europe. It actually defeated the theory that economic dependency is an antidote from a big conflict. And this basically reviews the whole architecture and attitude to containment policy towards non-democratic authoritarian regimes. This is basically a continuation of Elizabeth Trusk's narrative when she was Minister of Foreign Affairs of Great Britain. It was May of 22. We were conducting heavy fighting for Lysychansk, for Popasnaya, and she said in one of her statements, our mistake of the West was in that we decided that economic relations will affect seriously geopolitics. We removed the Vainik Amendment. We opened the markets, hoping that China, Iran, and Russia will evaluate economic benefits and will change their politics. And it turned out to be different. They used new economic capabilities to continue the previous course which they had before, and they turned their gains against us. And Australia is also addressing their citizens as well and their economy, because they have a group in Australia who is saying that sales of coal, Australian coal to China, it's one of the key export articles for Australia. And Australia is rather dependent on China in this regard. They had an issue a few years ago when China was blackmailing them with trade. And he's saying, look, we might sacrifice our economy and our economic preferences for politics and the ideals. You kind of see the shadow of Churchill and Roosevelt here, right? You haven't heard that rhetoric for a while. But of course, as Biden mentioned, we'll make money on the military-industrial complex as well. So the game is starting at a huge scale, and one should not think it will be deferred in 2027. It already is. What is happening in Israel now is part of that. It is essentially an action of the coalition of tyranny versus coalition of freedom. This war is already hot. So, in essence, Alexei, that provokes the dictatorship regimes to take their masks and gloves off, right? Yes. What Biden also highlighted is that the inner agenda of all the participants is now a hostage to the external agenda of the global choice. And now internally, all the partners of coalition need to make sure that they adhere to that global goal setting. So you could not sit on two chairs, and problems towards Orban and Fitz, they will be rising, and they will need to figure out whom are they with. And in Ukraine as well, those who are trying to say that they're Democrats but behave as dictatorship in the internal politics will have to make their decision and hopefully change course. Another interesting news that Chinese, according to a US publication, Chinese companies indeed sold dual-use technology and actually some military nomenclature to Russia, drones and such. And I'll tell you more, actually, more than just that. You'll actually be very surprised. I don't know in which key, but once these numbers will be shared and will be shared wide, you'll see that China indeed was supporting Russia quite a bit. So all the Chinese, we will not interfere, very quickly turned into support of Russian Federation. We can argue about the volumes, but they are supporting indeed. And Korea would not have done and would not have supplied anything without China if China would not have nodded for them to do that. Oh, 100%. Okay, so about Ukrainian politics, in regards to what's happening in the Middle East, Vladimir Zelensky had a conversation on Saturday with Turkish President Erdogan, and they discussed Russian-Ukrainian war, of course, and the conflict between Israel and Palestine. So I have a question. President Zelensky wanted to visit Israel before. Now this visit is at least postponed, and now he established a contact with Erdogan. And Erdogan is supposedly taking a somewhat Russia-like position in regards to Palestine. He is talking about the border of 1967, following the grand narrative of Palestine support. I don't know if he indeed is an apologist for Hamas, but do you think it's right for President Zelensky to call Erdogan about Palestine? It is not exactly a pro-Israeli position, right? Yuri had a great post, and I have Muslim friends who are writing to me, who are asking why Ukraine is so unilaterally, single-mindedly supporting Israel. You are positioning the whole Arab world against you when you do that, and that's millions of people. And I want to say, it's not us. We were put in juxtaposition by these people from Pyongyang, Beijing, Moscow, and Damascus. They didn't leave us a choice. They're telling, in response, you should have been an intermediary, an intermediary that helps to resolve the issue. You guys missed, and I'm answering that they missed a step. We already are being killed by the same weapons, by the same players who are attacking Israel from Palestine, who are being attacked by the same group of countries. So the world has already changed, and I hope that after Biden's speech they start to understand that. We are in a position where we cannot be on a different side, because we are fighting the common enemy as the Israel is. That's why that flash mob, where Israeli actually are writing on their ammo, "Glory to Ukraine," and we are signing our ammo, our shells, "Hello to Israel." And soldiers are recording videos to each other in different social media. Israeli military are recording videos with their hellos to Ukraine, and Ukrainian soldiers are recording videos with their greetings to Israel. And soldiers are different, right? There are some with 3 higher educations, but there are others as well. And soldiers, they feel the truth very sharply on the battlefront. And it's not some government-funded and supported flash mob. It's soldiers who are fighting somewhere near Avdeevka. They absolutely clearly see who are the real allies and what is the real game. So to my dear Arab and Muslim friends, colleagues, your words would have been very right, and we should have been an intermediary. It would have been a much better position for us in a previous phase. But after an attack from Gaza, the phase changed. We are now in one coalition against the other coalition. And what Shia Iran with the communist China and communist North Korea and vulgar capitalist Russia together in one coalition, this is a big question. Ask this question of yourself. What are you doing in this coalition with these figures? Yes, Yuri, and I also want to add here, guys, you need to be following your own steps, right? Turkey, that was supportive of Azerbaijan for their fight for Karabakh, they did not care that Azerbaijan was supporting Israel, by the way. And Israel was donating or selling some equipment to Azerbaijan. So that didn't stop them from cooperation where their interests coincided. Saudi Arabia, while they're making certain statements, because they're under pressure of the street and the street protests, just like majority of powers of the Arab countries who very often hate Hamas, just like in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Arab Emirates, but they have to consider the moods on the street because there are people with actively protesting and supporting Hamas. So Saudi Arabia during the last 20 years had annual annual trade with the United States worth of dozens of billions of dollars, 60, 80 billion dollars, depending upon the year, price for oil, etc. But where I'm leading to with this pragmatism of Arabs, it never really forced them from supporting Palestine and supporting it humanitarianly and with money. But in the meantime, they were just as fine dealing and trading with the so evil West. I'm not even talking about that same Arab capital and Saudi capital. They formed huge conglomerates with Western corporations for hundreds of billions of dollars. You can remember different stories, even connections to Dick Cheney, and they're approaching that relation rather pragmatically, and they're making money, trillions of dollars, I guess, over the last couple decades. So Ukraine, in my opinion, should also be rather pragmatic, and it shouldn't refuse relations with Turkey, regardless of what's happening on the Middle East. Nobody is actually requesting that. Turks are also pragmatic, and they can maneuver to make sure that they keep their own interest in mind. Since the Ottoman times, they know how to behave themselves. And on the other hand, yes, it is a moment when it's difficult to zig and zag, because what Alexei was saying at the beginning, it will force people to set their priorities and choose the side. And I'm asking a simple question of our Arabic friends. Look, we have received $200 billion worth of aid from the West as weapons, as economic aid, humanitarian aid. That's just for today. And what did we get from Arab countries as perhaps an equal measure, so that we, could say that we probably should be keeping a more balanced position towards Arab? Just cents, dimes. So the question is not even about judging it in some monetary equivalent, but the fact that this aid that was provided by the West allows Ukraine to physically resist and struggle for its freedom against Russia. No other group in the world is providing us that help. And Arabs, regardless of how much they scream that they support Palestine, they are not taking Palestinians in their countries. They could have opened borders and taken them. The West definitely takes them, and not afraid of possible interaction and maybe threats of terrorism, while their own Arabs are not. So, as an argument that Arab countries put out is that there could be some terrorist elements coming through from Palestine with refugees, or they could start some turmoil like they did in Jordan. So, my highlight is that Arabs will also have to understand and define the group that they want to join, and that price will likely be high to join one coalition or the other, because Ukraine is now paying also that bloody price for joining NATO, joining the West. But this is a very pragmatic choice for Ukraine. And we, of course, know that it has pragmatic roots, but it also is based on our values. Because it's difficult to support those forces that implement their politics via terrorist measures. I think that our relations with Arab world, with Muslim world, are very important. I don't think there is any Ukrainian who is welcoming the deaths of civilians in the Gaza sector. We talked about that before. But once again, we have not really chosen the coalition. We were forced into that. We paid for our neutrality a huge price. We were forced by being attacked, being brutally attacked. We tried to be a neutral, multi-vector country, and that neutrality costs a lot. Neutrality costs a lot because, first of all, you need to keep a very potent army, because an army as a part of a bloc, you don't need that much. But as a standalone, independent country, you definitely need a huge military capability. and we are paying the price now. So I think we will be supporting relations with all the countries, with Islam, with Muslim countries, although we are stating our position rather straightforward. But the status and possibility for us to be an intermediary, it's already gone. After October 7th, we realized that we are in this basket and our enemies are in the other. And that's what was noticed in Biden's speech as well. I also wanted to touch on what's happening on the front. Let's bring the map with Avdeevka. Look, I want to be in a stern position here, not a soothsayer, but I want to warn about a very serious danger. Now, a lot of analysts are smiling how many Russians are dying, the ones that are attacking Avdeevka. We've killed several thousand soldiers and destroyed hundreds of their equipment, and it's stupid, and Russians are idiots. I want to remind that Ilovaisk, Debaltsevo, Popasne, Lysychansk, Severodonetsk, Bakhmut, Solidar, they all started in the exact same fashion. And we were saying in the same way, oh, those waves of humans and that dozens of their equipment being burnt, and its old Zhukov style of attack will stand, it's not serious. Once again, I want to remind that they're exerting pressure for the 7th time. 6 previous times, we lost those territories eventually. I'm not saying we'll lose Avdeevka immediately, but I want to say that the threat of losing it is real. And you don't want to be too brave. You don't want to display bravado that you definitely will keep that and destroy all the Russian troops. The threat is real there, because you can see they're going for the road here up in the north. You can see 2 arrows. Into Avdeevka, there are at least 3 asphalt roads leading to that stronghold. There are also a dozen of smaller roads, but still, they're exerting a serious effort to cut one of those. And I suggest us to take it very seriously. And our society needs to be ready, if anything happens, to not be too surprised. How did it work? Because, frankly, I think we should have been taking that step back and taking a thought, a moment to think it out. How are we being captured for the 7th time into the same trap? I think our enemy sees 2 very basic elements that they know we always fall for, that we like to be heroes, that we never surrender, and that we don't want to give a land of our country, a piece of it, even for any strategic advantage. Without going too deep and arguing for the reasons of these peculiarities of our mindset, I would put a question differently. What if we have these 2 peculiarities? How could we reinforce the heroism of our fighters, and how do we fight so that we keep our territories? The answer is simple. We need our Surovikin line. It has to be built. It has to be 4 times more serious than, or 5 or 10, than Russian Surovikin line, generally speaking. And if right now in the area of Avdeevka was a serious defense line all over, then Russian losses would have been twice more, and the pressure on our troops would have been 3 times less. Why? Because when we are defending our positions in the field, are spending 3 times more shells when they're just in the field to defeat and destroy a certain number of enemies than they would have spent in a trench. And very often you deal with questions, why do we need to defend and all these lines when we're supposed to liberate our territories? It's easier to attack and to liberate our territories when you have a good fallback position. And by the way, we could have used civilians to help us build these fortification lines. Without sending these people to the front, you could have been paying them money. Nobody would attack them. That they're avoiding serving their country. They would have been taking their part in defending the country, and part of them, maybe upon having looked at the army, seeing that it's not too dangerous, too scary for them, they could have signed a contract as well, because they likely would be understanding that they're going to defend the same areas that they are fortifying. The analog of Todd's military construction army, or however you call it, could have built a whole defense line throughout the border that we have with Russia. And these fortifications would have alleviated the pressure on our troops and would have increased Russian losses. Today, General Naev, the head of defense of the North, said that we have 500,000 landmines deployed on the northern border, so there is no danger from Russian offensive on that side. I have a question. Why don't we have them in the areas where Russian troops are attempting the active action? Why do we not have landmines there? I recently put out a thesis that the defense of Bakhmut was not done properly, and the troops could be used more effectively down in the south to achieve more strategic events there. I already had people saying an opposite view, and one of them is saying that we still needed to defend Bakhmut, right? So we needed to defend it, and we need to throw down some troops there instead of the south. And to address their concern, I would say, yeah, first of all, we would have deployed our Surovikin line near Bakhmut, and then we should have been able to remove some of the troops from that front, and with much less losses, we could have moved our troops down south. And that pyramid of errors that Russians are getting us in, they are creating that pyramid of errors for us that we need to react to. It is based on the fact that we are not building long-term military fortifications along the front line. We don't have an answer. That's another thesis that I put out. There is no justification, no reasonable justification to explain why are we not building them and why we're not building them 18 months into this war. And on the fourth month of our attempt to break Russian fortifications in the south, which cost us quite a bit. And generally, we can already say that our autumn offensive is not too remarkable, and we'll need to renew it in winter or in next spring and summer. One looking at that should have understood the value of these fortification lines. There are no justifications to explain why we are not doing that. And this would allow us, we do have resources, we have engineering troops, we have civilian troops that we can invite to work that, I don't know, military engineers, industrial armies, however you call them, but we need to be building fortifications in scale everywhere, because even counter-attacking troops are much easier at their tasks when they have strong lines behind them. Because it is not just trenches, it is also hidden areas where you can stage ammo that you can use for offensive. You're creating double structures for roads, for bridges. Look, Russians are building additional railroad near Volnovakha. They're even putting new electric lines there and creating a defense system there too. What are we doing? We cannot dig concrete trenches? Why? Why our soldiers have to break their heads trying to break through Russian defense lines? And we still don't get it that it makes sense to build these defenses. There is no defense for that. It's indefensible, this position. And this is a direct responsibility of the political leadership. Military can only ask to do that. They cannot technically do that because Ukrainian law doesn't allow Ukrainian military to just go and build things, because very often it goes across the private property and all, and military have no rights to do that. So it needs to be taken on the political side, the decision, and they're failing to do that. And yet they find time to tax certain volunteer donations, which volunteers are saying likely will affect 3/4 of their effort. But they're failing to figure out the defense lines, which would have allowed our troops better terms for rotation, better rest, better defense, less casualties, less pressure, and more casualties for our enemy. On our blood, we could have learned that the defense lines are rather effective. They slowed us down in the south, and they allow you to concentrate and deconcentrate your, disperse your troops along the front line. But nothing is done. How can you explain that? And then later they're attacking Arestovich and saying that I am rattling the boat. Okay, Arestovich is bad, but answer my question. I think it's very logical, right? Give me the arguments. Why are we not doing it? Why our soldiers have to use shovels and knives to dig their small trenches and defend their positions in this way, instead of having fully professional, equipped trench line, fortified from different kinds of attacks. And when the first line is being attacked, you can move to the second. If the second is under fire, you can move to the third or return back to the first, just like it is written in the books. Why not? And let's add here, Alexei, that the story with Fortress Bakhmut from the beginning of this year, as some analysts are saying, it was pulling a lot of resources from the southern front. Nikolai, not all of the Russian resources from the southern front. However, they indeed destroyed a lot of Russian troops, right? Defense was separated into several phases. The first phase was good. We were grinding them very effectively, but as they were taking key positions and key areas, it became very uncomfortable to defend that location. And defense of Bakhmut, which is in the valley, is not a good idea because there are heights around it, and Russians were using artillery from those heights that would just collapse the whole building. And our military would often not even see who's shooting at them. Long-range artillery was a serious threat. My friend, a battalion commander, was for 12 days in rotation, and in 10 days they left Bakhmut with 50% losses. And most of their losses didn't even see who shot them. Long-range artillery just comes in and destroys. So there are certain heights around Bakhmut which are much better used for defense like that. You can leave the city in the valley and make it a trap for the enemy. This is active defense, and this is how you do it. Of course, if there were civilians there, we should have been defending them, but Bakhmut is already empty. So the forces that were used there, and the whole PR project that I think was done, that they caused us to not have enough troops in the south that we needed, because we were training them, including abroad. We didn't have enough troops to have it in the south. We should have had 3 military corps, 3 army corps in the south. It's not a secret, but we only had 2. I've seen that in the Russian open media already, so it's not too big of a secret. And our commanders already, and journalists already noted that. And the second, and basically one army corps wasn't formed because it was wasted near Bakhmut. And the other element is that professional troops were wasted, who were presenting tremendous courage defending that area, instead of fortifying smart areas around it and causing more casualties for Russians. And the third one is that, how should I put it, that we started to throw mobilized troops to defend Bakhmut, because we used strategic reserves, professionally trained people who we wanted to use in the south, and we needed to form the whole new detachments for defense of Bakhmut. Basically, taken from the street, very quick training. I'm not going to give a time frame to demoralize people, but very quickly after that, that person dies in Bakhmut in a short span from being drafted, just like Russians did on their side. We were accusing Russians that after the draft in 5 days, some of the soldiers were already captured. Our situation in Bakhmut wasn't much different, trust me. And that demotivates people. That actually creates a lot of stress in the society when you do something like that. When they see that people are being drafted immediately, rapidly on the streets, and then thrown in the fight, and very quickly their family get a notice that they're dead. That situation is generally being repeated near Avdeevka. You think something changed? Nothing. Nothing changed. And Avdeevka is, I remind us, 7th city that we can lose in the same pattern. So what it means we are predictable. That is the worst thing that can happen to you at war. There are certain features of our mentality that are very predictable and calculatable by our enemies. And over again, they do the same thing. And of course, we can celebrate that we're burning a lot of their equipment and destroying a lot of their army. But my thought is that we need to burn 3 times that equipment and 3 times of their troops in a fortified position. Because it's rather simple to predict where they will start their advancing maneuvers. It's basic. All right, let's add another news. To conclude this stream, we are way over time today, but this is still an important information, everything that we're discussing, and we're still leaving a lot of news behind. But okay, let's take this one. From now on, the means of radio electronic interference will be getting to Ukrainian military in a much faster fashion, because they will be adopted by quick test or according to their specifications. Minister of Digital Information Fedorov, together with Minister of Defense, came out and made the statement about it. So basically, he's saying things changed, and it would be much easier to accept UAVs and radio electronic interference to be used by our military. I think Article 389 of Criminal Code of Ukraine prohibits the importation of illegal or unlicensed recording devices, and drones and everything of that type actually falls under this article. So all those people who are bringing us drones, they're technically under this article of criminal code. So I have a request to our congressmen who are peddling some ideas about putting Aristovich in jail for whatever drummed up artificial charges you come up with. Put me in jail, solve this matter. But the next step, make sure you get together and you cancel this article or stop its work during the times of war. Because every person who brings in a drone to the territory of Ukraine technically falls under this criminal prosecution article. But I guess you're a little too busy with Arestovich, right? Super threat from me. You can join together with Danilov. He also has a tooth against me, I guess. And then please address this matter in regards to enhancing our military. I think that Partnov and whoever else were adopting this code, initially criminal code, it almost feels like they were targeting certain things to make our army weaker, to make our response weaker. But if I'm correct, it's 389. But every drone is criminal now in Ukraine, and that adds also additional customs regulations and other things. So Mikhail Fedorov, I should advise him, and he's one of the few really bright people out there. He's a vice prime minister. Please pay attention to that article. You guys can change it. It is important to do so. I also want to hear a comment from you guys if you know anything about the radio interference systems in our military. What needs to be sent there? Well, Nikolai, let's walk from afar. It's the end of the stream, but I'll try to be quick. Russians had very few achievements before this war, and one of their main breakthroughs were radio electronic interference. And they learned from their lessons in Georgia, and they indeed actually built something better than the global examples. They usually boast about everything, but radio electronic means they have a pretty stellar. They have even down to the company level, Borisogledsk and others, whatever models they have, they figured that this is effective. They used them in the previous phase of war, and now they made a qualitative jump in their radio interference, starting with anti-drone devices, which is a small tactical radio electronic element, to really big units that can block even satellite communications, that can provide interference to HIMARS missiles and prevent them from accurate shooting. So they had built up on that. They had some initial stuff built in back in 97, and they were just elaborating and elaborating and growing and growing and growing. So this is indeed a problem for our troops. And we are just starting. We are just at the beginning of this road. We have some achievements too, starting by volunteers who brought anti-drone weapons from the West, which are always needed, and down to bigger systems as well, division-size systems, but the difference is by an order of magnitude, if not two. And we need to definitely catch up on this. We need to probably increase financing 10 times from what we have now to make sure we expedite the development and production on all the nomenclature, from individual user anti-drone rifles to complex big mobile systems. And a friend of mine, Mikhail, is actually texting me right now about that same matter. So he is doing a lot with his drone army, by the way, but there's a ton of things that needs to be done in this aspect of our industrial complex. And my thesis is, I'll bring one example for you to understand how it works. We have a system called Kalchuga. This is a unique Ukrainian system, and just appearance of one in Iraq back in the day spoiled relations of the United States and Ukraine under Kuchma. It provides intel services in the range of 1,500 kilometers, and unlike Czech complex Tamara, it can see everything: sky, ground, and water. So we can see Kerch Bridge, Taman Peninsula, all the way down to Urals and Russian territory, and it's passive. The enemy doesn't even see that it's being monitored. So for whatever reasons, this complex was not being accepted to the military of Ukraine. And there were some financial issues and other things. But why it was not, one of the main reasons why it was not accepted by military before the war, it has certain antennas poking out of it. And they have certain rubberized seals in the area where the antennas go up and go down from that machine. So you need a bunch of those rubberized pieces, maybe 50 a year, to make sure that you have this equipment functional. So the government refused to produce these rubberized parts, and it refused to let private companies to build that. So the complex was not battle ready. It's a unique system that we could have been using all the time. Because of 50 silly rubberized pieces were not being allowed for private companies to produce. First thing we need to adopt is extraordinary situation in the industrial complex and let private companies build things and let them sign contracts directly with down to a level of a company, not even battalion or brigade, but go into financial relations all the way down to the company. Just like in many other armies of the world, where they do have accounts and they can make purchases, accept donations. Extraordinary measures that I'm talking about are needed not to provide some extraordinary capabilities for bureaucracy, but to actually limit bureaucracy. Because all these approval systems and everything, that takes too long, and it is paid daily by the blood of our soldiers and civilians. We need to connect manufacturing party with military, with our troops on the front, and provide continuous framework for them. And government, of course, can create certain framework and define how it should be done, but this is important. And by the way, military defense complex can also provide additional work capabilities, work spaces for our people in the country, and we can actually build and earn money on that. So this is direct responsibility of the Committee of the Defense, the Office of the President, Ministry, the Cabinet of Ministers. This is what they should be doing right now. What are they doing right now instead? Let's ask the question differently. Are they doing this? No, they're not. So let them answer a question. Why are they not addressing these problems? A very simple question from military, from society. Why are you not addressing key elements of our defense? Why soldiers have to violate criminal code and ask from their commanders to get the FPV drones that are being produced somewhere in basements. But if you officially supply them through Ministry of Defense and go through tenders, it'll take you 9 months. So soldiers and their commanders need to find ways through volunteers to get these drones immediately, because the Russian operation is going right now to Avdeevka and Priyutna. You need those drones, those UAVs on the front right now. But if you follow all the rules and procedures, it'll take you the bigger part of the year. Why? Very simple question. Please answer. And on this hanging question in the air, I suggest we end today's stream. And let's make a pause till Monday. Thank you, gentlemen. And thank you, everybody who watched us today. Once again, we are doing monetary collections for the 3rd Storm Brigade. You can find the link at the bottom of this video. And you've been watching Alpha Media, channels of Alexei Arestovich, channel of Yuri Romanenko, and English translation was done by Privateer Station. Do not forget to click like and subscribe. Have a quiet night.